thanks very much for the invitation to join, and I'm delighted to be followed by Richard. The Keston Institute for Public Finance and Infrastructure has been doing some great work looking at infrastructure challenges in California, including water as part of that. So I'm going to give you a sort of quick overview of this report. This is the sort of shiny version of it. We try to, at PPIC, Public Policy Institute of California, this is a nonprofit independent research organization that really aims to look at a lot of different issues relating to California policy. So not just water and natural resources, sort of covering a broad range of things. And we aim to, as one of our target audiences, really try to inform folks in the legislature, in the administration, local government, sort of the policymaking audience, as well as the broader sort of interested public, as well as the sort of research audience. And the way we try to kind of mesh those is that the PPIC reports tend to be sort of nice looking, digestible. All of the references are there, but they're at the back. You know, the footnotes are their endnotes and stuff, so that the formulas aren't in there. Those are up on the web and so on. There is actually a more detailed version of this piece, which is it came out as a law review article, which is also available on our website. If you go to the same page as the PPIC report, you can download that if you want more details and more footnotes and so on. So just with that as introduction, this is some joint work with a large team of researchers, none of whom, besides me, is from PPIC. Actually, we have folks from 3 UC campuses and from Stanford participating in this, and it's an interdisciplinary project. Water is one of those things that really touches on a range of different disciplines in engineering, hydrogeology, ecology and biology, law, as well as economics. So we're trying to kind of bring together a broad cross-section of folks to take a look at California's water challenges. And this is actually a first installment in a project that we're doing, this team, together to look at really some of the big challenges for California water in this century. So we thought we'd kind of kick it off with trying to sort of lay some groundwork and talking about California water myths. And I want to also acknowledge that we have a broad group of generous funders who've been supporting this work from both Northern and Southern California. So laying the groundwork, California water myths. Let me see. What I want to do is kind of just give you an overview of what's in the piece. We have 8 myths that we talk about in the report, and we got this idea of looking at myths because it just seems like there's often a lot more heat than light in the public policy discussions, both in Sacramento and what you see in the media, and sort of water is one of those things that has a lot of stakeholder interest and regional interests, and a lot of people kind of trying to, in some ways, maybe spin the topic in a way that is particularly puts them in a good light and others in a bad light and so on. And we thought that it really could be useful to kind of look at how much of what's out there in terms of the popular discussions about water is true, and where does one really need to kind of hone that to sort of find the reality part of it, and what part is kind of not truth or either misperception or misunderstanding. And so we did this by looking at some key myths on the water supply question for California, on ecosystem management, and on the legal framework for water and governance issues, and then kind of go from there to what we might need to do to get better information and to improve the policy discourse. So I'm going to kick right in with the water supply myths. The first one, and this one we were hearing a lot over the last 3 years, we're probably going to hear it again this summer a lot, is that California is running out of water. This is something that we've, actually if you go back in time, you'll see that this kind of crops up every time we have several years in a row of drought. This cartoon that I'm showing you was from 1991, when we had we were in the midst of a multi-year drought, and we were threatened with rationing in large parts of the state. And so we look at this and we say, well, okay, what's the truth and what's the reality there? And the the truth is that water is scarce and is going to be becoming scarcer, but that's partly linked to the kind of climate we live in, and that we actually have a lot of potential in California. We've already shown this over history, and we're continuing to show it, a lot of potential to adapt to this scarcity. And so sort of thinking about it in terms of running out of water, the implication is, okay, we just got to go out and build new infrastructure, but actually if you think about it as managing scarcity and adapting to scarcity, you think about doing what's cost effective, and maybe there are some ways in which you're going to have to improve and expand the infrastructure, but also ways in which you can use the resource more efficiently. And so this graph shows you basically going back to the early 60s. This is data from the Department of Water Resources, and going over, but basically on average every 5 years, as part of California water plans updates, they look at this, an estimate of total water use by the urban and agricultural sectors and how that has been changing over time. And these, I should point out, are not sort of wet. They kind of smooth out the wet and dry year issue. It's normalized, or else it's kind of normal water years. So this is kind of, you can think about this as some long-term trends. And what you can see is that there has been some decline in recent years in water use availability for the urban and ag sectors. That's been partly, the urban sector has done well in the sense of keeping water use flat despite population growth. And the real hit has been taken in terms of applied water use by the ag sector, which has been coming down since the mid-90s. Now what we find is that this is actually, a lot of this is linked to improvements in use efficiency, although clearly there's also been some shifts in the ag sector toward crops that don't necessarily need as much water, and some compression of irrigated acreage. Second myth, this is the villain myth. This is my favorite, actually. Everywhere in the state, somebody's going to have a water villain that they are going to point to as sort of the source of California's water woes. So we kind of just have the myth where it's an optional. You can pick your villain, and we talk about a few of them. This is a much more recent cartoon from the Sacramento Bee. I think he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist, Rex Babin, who had been drawing. Has anybody heard of the Peripheral Canal? Okay, so he has a drawing about the Peripheral Canal. This is an idea of tapping. The southern part of the state gets a fair amount of water from the northern part of the state, and it comes through the delta just to the east of San Francisco. And so he had a drawing of a straw from the Northern California to LA, and then when they discovered water on the moon, he came out with a second version of a peripheral canal. And just to show how thirsty you guys are down here in LA, that you'd be willing to go to any lengths to steal water from somebody else. So this is one of the favorite villains of people in Northern California, is that Southern Californians are those. If it weren't for them and their pools and their lawns, we wouldn't have water problems in the state. So we had to debunk this one. And actually, when the report came out, a number of radio stations down here liked this one a lot because it made you guys look good. Actually, that there's been a lot of effort in Southern California, and in particular in the areas where most of the population lives, which is in the sort of the South Coast hydrologic region, to reduce per capita use, especially since that last drought from the early 90s on. So, in fact, per capita water use is among the lowest in the state in the South Coast area. It's much higher in the inland areas. Now, before we start, because one of the favorite villains of Southern Californians is the folks in Sacramento who don't have water meters. It's the case that in the inland areas where water use is higher, there are some sort of climate reasons for that too. Sort of, it's easier to use less when you live on the coast and it's more moderate. There's also sort of the way the house structure is organized. You know, the housing structure is organized. Lot sizes are bigger and so on in the inland areas. So there are some sort of reasons why they're not necessarily water villains either. And they've also been making efforts to reduce per capita use. But anyway, you guys are not off the hook either, because there's still more you can do, I should say. So another favorite villain of the urban sector in general is farmers who are subsidized by the federal government. one of the big sources of water for agriculture in the Central Valley is a project, a federally run and owned project called the Central Valley Project. And that was built starting back in the 30s as part of actually economic recovery spending in that era, some infrastructure spending. And it was built with, to a large extent, thanks to the largesse of the federal taxpayer. Now, those are dollars which were a lot, it was cheaper to do it back then than it is now, even if you look in real terms. But there clearly are some subsidies that continue to this day to many of the farmers that receive Central Valley Project water. What we looked at, though, was, okay, given that there are some subsidies, people think about them, this is a sort of a villain issue because they think it's unfair and leads to a lot of inefficiency. And the argument we're making is that they're not necessarily unfair because, in fact, a lot of these folks, whatever you want to say about whether the subsidy was justified or not at the time, have bought their land since then. And so the land actually has a value that's higher because the subsidies are there, so the water's cheaper. So in fact, many of the current owners are not subsidized in the sense that they paid a higher price for that land. So somebody got a windfall, but it was the original landowners of who got the initial contracts in many cases. The other thing is that the subsidies are not necessarily leading to inefficient water use because the farmers that get this water are making decisions that many of them don't have enough water relative to what they would like to have for their crop production. So at the margin, they're getting some cheap water, but they're actually at the margin buying much more expensive water to complete their crop mix. And these are some of the folks that have put in place some of the most efficient irrigation systems in agriculture. And that's partly, thanks to the arrival of a water market and so on, that they've been able to kind of use the water in a more efficient way. So the fact that there is a cheap price for some of that water does not mean that bad decisions are being made about what crops to grow necessarily. The other thing is that people often assume that every farmer is subsidized, and that's not true. It's some farmers within the Central Valley Project, but there's a state water project that provides water which is not subsidized, that's paid for by users, and many local projects that are paid for by users. So that's sort of the farmer villain. Now here comes another favorite villain, which is the Endangered Species Act. And this has been a villain that's been in the news a lot over the last few years because in addition to having a drought, we've also been facing constraints on moving water through the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which has impacted water users south of the Delta and to the west of the Delta that get water both in the Bay Area, urban Bay Area, urban Southern California, and the San Joaquin Valley. So there's been a lot of sort of rhetoric about how these pumping cutbacks, because of fish in the Delta doing badly, have been very, very much the culprit and the source of the problem. And Fox News came to the Central Valley and did 3 shows on this, showing how it was people versus fish and how this Delta smelt, this little fish, was causing all these problems. And so what we wanted to highlight was that there's some truth there in the sense that, yes, there have been some cutbacks as a result of these regulations, but that's not the whole story. And this graph kind of, I think I'll explain so you can see how that highlights it. All of these orange bars, that's the amount of water in thousands of acre feet. So the right side vertical axis, thousands of acre feet that move through the Delta, to the pumps for both the federal and the state projects every year, going all the way back to the late 60s. And that was about at the time when the state water projects started to come online. So you see some increases there when that began to happen, and then increases really through the 80s. You can see the effects of that drought in the early 90s when the pumping went down, back up again. And now these last 2 years, so 2008 and 2009, some significant cutbacks in pumping. And what we've highlighted there, the light orange, that's the amount of water, additional water, that they would have gotten if there hadn't been these regulations. So about 500,000 acre feet, which is about 20%, 15–20% of what they, of a normal year of supply. And so Yes, it's important, but it's not the whole story. And the other thing is that even if you didn't have the Endangered Species Act, there are many other reasons in terms of Clean Water issues, Act issues and other regulatory aspects of our water system that means that you wouldn't just be able to have a free-for-all in terms of pumping. So, no villains, but we could all do somewhat better at managing water. Myth 3, this is about solutions. And this one often goes hand in hand with the first myth that we're running out of water. This is that we can build our way out of California's water problems. And there are a few favorite solutions here. It's the idea of sort of concrete and technology is going to do it for us. New surface storage, that's been a big part of the debate in California over the last decade, I would say, whether we have enough surface storage or whether we should build more in order to expand our water supply by capturing more of it in the wet months. A peripheral canal, so building a different kind of connection of water from the north to the southern part of the delta, so that we can avoid these regulatory problems I just talked about. Desalination is another favorite one. You know, why we have all this ocean coastline, why don't we just go and build more desal? That's a favorite one for farmers, actually. They think, why, cities should just build desal and we can use the other water and everything will be fine. So what we say is that the reality is that infrastructure can contribute, but it's not a cure-all. And there really is no silver bullet. And just to highlight with these 3 examples, to kind of give you a sense. First, to look at new surface storage. What we're showing here is, on the left-hand side, this is a pie chart that shows you the surface storage capacity in the state. About 41 million acre-feet existing surface storage capacity. And just to give you an idea, that's about the amount of water total, the developed water total that we use, but we use a lot of groundwater as well and water coming out of the rivers. So the proposed additions, the 2 main proposed additions of surface storage, one in Northern California and one off the San Joaquin River in the Eastern Sierras, is about 7% expansion in that capacity. And now let's compare with what that would get you on average in terms of supply. Yeah, okay, right, the existing use, about 38 million acre feet. That's an average over 25 years. It would add about 1% on average. Now, why so much less? Because we actually have a lot of surface storage already. And so there are many years when you just wouldn't be able to fill it more. And this is sort of work looking at modeling. It's expensive, which is one of the reasons it's been a big source of debate. There's pretty much no way we would build these projects unless there were some pretty significant subsidies. So this is something actually that's part of the water bond that is on the ballot for November. There's $3 billion reserved for infrastructure projects like this that could include surface storage, and the idea is that it would pay up to half of the amount, with users paying the other half. So surface storage can have some benefits, but it's not a panacea. It's not going to, that extra 1% is not going to make California's water problems go away. Peripheral canal. This is one that folks that depend on the delta and that have been really facing these regulatory challenges have been kind of focusing on as a sort of silver bullet solution. And this is a topic that we've done a lot of work with. Some of the folks on this same team with me from UC Davis, we've come out with several studies looking at this. And we actually did say that among the solutions for California water with respect to the delta, that a peripheral canal is probably the best way to balance environmental and economic objectives for the state. So we kind of come at this as folks who are kind of feeling like a peripheral canal could be a good solution. And what we wanted to highlight here by kind of trying to debunk the myth is not to say the peripheral canal cannot be helpful, but that it's not a panacea, and that folks that think it is are going to be really disappointed by any kind of policy outcome that we're going to get, because in order for this to work, it has to be accompanied by some significant efforts to improve fish populations in the delta. So that's going to mean funding for ecosystem restoration, as well as probably more water. And so some export cuts are going to be likely no matter what, with the peripheral canal or not, relative to those historical levels that I showed you in the orange bar from that chart earlier. And folks are therefore going to have to be thinking about planning for a future that doesn't rely on the abundance that they were getting from the delta in the past. Third is silver bullet, sort of in the infrastructure, seawater desalination. Here, what we're saying is that seawater desalination definitely has some potential in some places, but that it's expensive enough that it's going to be a marginal part of our water solutions. And this is just to highlight that. These are some cost estimates from the latest California Water Plan, plus some estimates from the team on sort of ranges of costs per acre foot per year for a variety of different types of solutions. Underground storage, water marketing or transfers, agricultural use efficiency, urban use efficiency, recycled wastewater, which is using some of the same technology as desal, surface storage, and a couple of different kinds of desal. One is brackish desal. That's used already in the Chino Basin area, where if groundwater is somewhat saline, you can clean it up, but it's not as salty as ocean water. And then ocean desal. And you can see that just it's, even though costs have been coming down, people have been expecting costs to come down ever since. You see texts written in the 50s and 60s with people thinking about desal as like the next thing that's just coming around the corner, and it's still expensive. So there was just some analysis for Monterey County where desal probably is going to be a useful option because they don't have a lot of other alternatives. They're finding that the studies that they've done, it turns out the costs are higher than they expected. So no silver bullets. What we're saying is that you really have to think about managing water and California's water future as a kind of a portfolio approach where you're combining a lot of different options. And this is something that's not a surprise to water managers in utilities. They kind of already have gotten that message and are working in that way. But a lot of the sort of political discussion about water kind of still tends to focus on the silver bullets. So another kind of silver bullet, this is our fourth myth. This is kind of the flip side of we can build our way out of the problem, is that we can conserve our way out of the problem. And clearly conservation, water use efficiency has been an important part of the story already in California. The graph I showed you right in the beginning of the trends in water use, there's been a lot of gains in efficiency, and that's what's helped us to deal with scarcity to a large extent. And conservation also provides some environmental benefits, because if you're taking less water out of a stream, it's better for the aquatic ecosystem. It's energy friendly to conserve, because a lot of energy use in California is actually at the level of households' water use, because there's a lot of energy involved in heating water and so on. So there are all kinds of good things that come with conservation, including in some cases net water savings. But the discussions on this often assume that any drop conserved is a drop of water saved and available for somebody else to use, and that's wrong. And so these photos are kind of highlighting a little bit about why that's wrong. So here you see on the left a field with flood irrigation. You look at that and think, what a waste of water, right? But whatever the crops don't use, pretty much everything that the crops are not going to use is going to be going back into the system and available for somebody else to use. It's either going to go back into drainage ditches and back into the surface water system to be used by somebody downstream, or it's going to percolate down into the groundwater basin, recharge the groundwater basin, be available for somebody to use, not necessarily the next year, but over time. So when somebody switches from flood irrigation to this very nice drip irrigation with the drip technology, where just every drop goes to the plant, it allows you to expand acreage. And because we've got the land available in California, that's one of the reasons farmers have been moving to more efficient irrigation techniques, is to be able to stretch the available applied water, to get as much out of it as they can. The consequences of this are that there's less that goes back into the system. So you're getting some good things. You're doubling your crops, or you're expanding your yield out of what you apply, but there's less water available downstream for the next guy, or in the groundwater basin for next year. And this is an issue that's also true in the urban sector. A lot of urban water use goes right back into the system. It goes into the wastewater system, it gets cleaned up, and it goes back into the river and gets used by somebody else. Where we get good net savings in both in the ag sector and in the urban sector are when that water isn't available for reuse by somebody else. And there are two ways to do that. One is by shifting to crops that use less water. And that's true so for our landscapes. If we shift from lawns to sort of California-friendly type plants in the urban sector, if farmers shift from crops that use 3.5 acre feet to crops that use 2.5 acre feet per acre, that's a net savings because there's just less of it being absorbed by the crops. That's one way. The other way is if all of the water that leaves the field or that leaves the wastewater treatment system goes somewhere where it can't be reused again, like here in LA or where I live in San Francisco. Our water, if we save it, we're making net savings because otherwise it would go into the ocean and be lost until it gets desalinated again. So those are net savings, which is why when folks in SoCal think that folks in Sacramento are water villains because they don't have meters and everything, somebody in Sacramento who's wasting water, there are maybe environmental issues and energy issues and so on, but that water is going to get reused by somebody else. It's going to come back into the system and be used by, well, not me because I live in San Francisco, so I get water from Yosemite, but for the people that are drawing on the Sacramento River further down. So those are the water supply myths. Now let's switch to the ecosystem. Already had one idea of an ecosystem villain, the Endangered Species Act. There's also just a lot of myths about ecosystem management, and this has been a growing tension in California for sure. One of the reasons I think, if you remember that the sort of overall trend of water use for urban and ag sectors going down, a big part of the reason is that we've been devoting more water to the ecosystem in recent years, and that's because we've been discovering that there are a lot of systems where our water projects and our water infrastructure of the past had not been put in place with real foresight about what it was going to do for the fish and the aquatic ecosystems. So there's been, through various regulatory actions, legal actions, there's been an effort and a requirement, in fact, to devote more attention to that, to try to restore some systems. So it's going to be a continuing issue because basically we're looking at a future where a lot of our fish are in danger of extinction. Even if they're not already listed on the Endangered Species Act, many of them are coming to. So we wanted to address this issue of, okay, fish versus people. And then we kind of characterize the myth as healthy ecosystems are in direct conflict with a healthy economy. That if every drop we're taking away from people to give to fish is bad for the economy. And what we tried to highlight in this myth is that, yes, for sure, sometimes there are some direct trade-offs, but that people are often forgetting that a healthy ecosystem can have a lot of economic benefits. And that includes cleaner water, which means lower treatment costs for water. So that's a direct translation back into economic costs for households and businesses, but also just all of the recreational benefits of healthy ecosystems, which is important in California. And if you look over time, the California economy has really been shifting in such a way that services are becoming a much bigger part of the economy, and recreational related services are becoming a much bigger part of the economy. So if we trash our ecosystems, that's also trashing an important part of our economy. Right now, recreation is actually a much bigger part of our economy than agriculture, for example. If you just look at it on a jobs per sector, for example. So there are some reasons why you want to think about the ecosystem as part of a healthy economy. And then the other thing is that there are many ways in which mutually beneficial management is possible. And so what these slides show you is an example of that. So these are from the Yolo bypass. I don't know, for folks who have ever driven up I82 Sacramento, just before you get to Sacramento, there's this sort of area that's just like you're on a sort of the highway's a little bit on stilts, and you're driving up, and there's these fields, and depending on what time of year, it's either flooded, kind of a wetlands area, or it's rice fields. This is a bypass that was built to help manage flood risks in the Sacramento area. It's when the rivers get really full, they can spread the water there, and it moves through fairly quickly, and so it's a way of keeping Sacramento somewhat out of harm's way. And this was done by purchasing, it's ag land, so it was done by purchasing easements So that the farmers there said, okay, well, I will, in exchange for some payment now, it's okay for you to flood our land during the spring if you need to. And then they take that risk, and then they can farm it sort of after that season. And so it's actually a pretty vibrant agricultural area. There's rice that's grown there. There's some cows. But it's also an incredible ecological resource, wetland for birds and also for fish. And it's actually, if you look sort of at places around the delta, which is so compromised now, it's one of the places that's really one of our hopes for providing some ecosystem restoration that's going to help us to get out of the mess that we're in. It's also actually a nice recreational area for bird watching. So the other myth that's really key is that, and this is one that you hear in a lot of the policy discussions about every time there's a potential for regulation and the need to provide sort of attention to aquatic ecosystems, how much water do the fish need? That's sort of the question. And a sort of underlying assumption of that is that more water will, on its own, lead to healthy fish populations. And so what we're saying here is that, in many places, there is a problem of not enough water for fish in our systems, in our aquatic systems, but that just putting the question in terms of how much water do the fish need, it kind of gets you to not focus on water as a resource for fish, which is not just about quantity, it's about timing, sort of when do you need it, it's about quality, sort of what quality of that water, how salty, how fresh, how clean, in other ways. And very key thing, it's also about temperature. So if you're not thinking about the combination of those factors, you're just thinking about how many drops to add, you're likely not going to succeed in your ecosystem objectives. So these photos are from the Klamath River, and it just gives you, this is a place where both the quality in terms of nutrient loads and the temperature are big issues. So this is an important salmon run river. This is right up on the border between California and Oregon. And there have been tremendous problems and conflicts in this area over some time. When I first came to California in 2001, there were farmers staging sit-ins up there because water to farms had been cut off in order to provide water for the fish. There had been tremendous fish die-offs. And it turns out, sort of once some of the research was done on this, that a big part of the problem was temperature and the nutrients from agriculture that were in the system. So thinking about that as a package is really important. So legal and governance myths. This is sort of the last category. I'm going to show you two of them. And we're lucky to have two really eminent legal scholars on the team, Buzz Thompson and Brian Gray. So this one is really, we had a lot of fun discussing this with them. Sort of the question of whether California's water rights system is just so messed up that we can't improve our management of our water. And so we debated this quite a bit, and they were both of the view, and they document this in the report and in the longer law review article, that yes, we have a very complex, archaic, if you look at it, I mean, it seems like a crazy system. We've got, I don't know, maybe 6 different kinds of water rights. Groundwater, it's got a different kind of right system from different kinds of surface water. We have a mix of English-style rights, riparian, plus sort of Western appropriative rights. We got rights that are dated differently in time. So if your water rights were from before the modern water code that came into effect in 1914, you're kind of off the hook for a lot of things that folks that after that are required to do. So yes, it's a mess, and we don't have a very good accounting system to keep track of it, but that if you look at actually our laws and regulatory capacity, we can do a lot. And so their view, which they convince us of as a team, is that we don't need to think about complete overhaul of our water rights system in order to have reform and sustainable management of the resource. And 3 of the sort of pillars of that thinking are, one of them is Article 10, Section 2 of the Constitution, which requires all water, no matter what flavor of water right, pre-1914, post, and so on, all water has to meet a reasonable use standard. And that is something which is flexible over time in terms of the definition of reasonable use. So as water becomes more scarce and the economy shifts, that means that it's possible to reinterpret what constitutes reasonable use and what constitutes waste. That's a fundamental thing that really gives us flexibility. Now, just a kind of example of that, what they also show is that there is a legal potential for all levels of government as well as civil parties to act on this. So I'm showing you the sort of cute kind of modern design toilet there. The legislature has put in place, and actually the federal government as well, low flow plumbing codes. That's basically saying that now it is not reasonable use anymore to buy a water guzzling toilet. And low flow toilets, just to give you an idea, the most modern ones now use 1/10 of the amount of water that the sort of water guzzlers that were around up until the early 90s use. And so that's sort of an example of saying society can change its way of doing business. We're also now going to have new codes on what kind of irrigation systems for urban irrigation use can be bought. Now there has to be a standard. In the same way that we have energy efficiency codes, we can have these water use efficiency codes for technology. Now another example of sort of another legal tenet is the public trust doctrine. And this is a common law doctrine that basically says that the state has the right to protect the broader public interest with water use. And this example is a very famous case that was kind of a test case for this in California, the Mona Lake case, and this directly concerns LA actually. So the LA water system, a lot of the water in LA comes from the Owens Valley and the Mona Lake area out in the eastern Sierras. And it was found that LA basically was taking too much out of the system, and so this saline lake out in the eastern Sierras, just to the other side of Yosemite, was falling, the level was falling to the point where it was creating tremendous habitat problems. And this is an important part of the Pacific Flyway. So took some time, court cases and regulatory decisions, basically to reach a compromise and say, okay, well, LA does not have to restore it to the original level, but it has to be pumping enough less to allow the lake level to go up to a point that is going to allow ecosystem restoration. So the conclusion is that the tools are there for reform, and we just need to start using them, which is a political challenge, admittedly significant one. And then the last myth I want to kind of close with is myth 8. This is the myth about consensus, and that there is a win-win in all situations, and we can find a consensus that will keep everybody happy. And this has been kind of a trend in the way California water politics has been working over, especially since the early 90s, with a lot of very consultative processes involving stakeholders and so on. And we're not saying that stakeholder involvement is bad by any means, but that it's unrealistic to expect that you're going to solve all big problems by getting everybody in the room and singing Kumbaya. And the drawing, this was actually, so I gave this talk first back in December before there was a healthcare act. And so this was back when there were a lot of debates. This is actually a cartoonist from the Albuquerque newspaper. So it kind of gives you an idea of what you can get in consensus situations is that everybody points the finger at somebody else, right? So they're not part of the problem, but they want theirs. And so the consensus is that somebody else has to solve the problem. And we saw this in California water with something called the CalFed process, which was an effort, a sort of very stakeholder-driven effort to try to get a solution for the Delta. The only thing that kept that process going was the hope and promise of a lot of taxpayer-funded money to make it work. And that ended up not coming, the federal part of that didn't come forth. The state part came forth to some extent, and we never saw the local part really coming forth, and so it kind of fell on its own weight. So what we're saying is that there are going to be tough trade-offs in California water challenges and solutions over the coming decades, and that a consensus process is not always going to get us to the solutions. That we're going to, in some cases, really need leadership to get to solutions. So just to kind of wrap up with where we think we need to go from here. a big part of it is information. And now one of the things that's kind of amazing if you think about the modern California economy is how lousy our water information systems are. And this is not to say that at the local level they're always lousy. A lot of the local utilities are pretty good at what they do. In Southern California there are some very sophisticated water management systems, but we don't require a sort of centralized collection of that information, and there are some things that are just off limits in terms of groundwater monitoring. You're not required by law to report how much water you use. A lot of places, ag water use, there's not metering and so on. So we just don't have a lot of good detailed information on some of the water use, and we're not required to report to be able to do some overall analysis at the statewide level of some of the information that is collected. So we need to get better at collecting and disseminating that information, partly to help debunk the myth of what's happening with trends in water use and so on. Now, to use California's water rights laws better, we said that they are usable, they're on the books. What's on the books is totally adequate to get us where we need to be, but we need better information on what's actually used. And so that means reporting of water use by all users, not just the ones that fall into certain flavors of water rights holders. And then for tackling some of these ecosystem management problems and getting better at portfolio management, we really need more analysis at the independent analysis of policy options and policy choices. And this is something where there just hasn't been enough effort in the state in quite some time. So just to sort of leave you with our messages for going forward, we're saying there's really a basis for having a less myth-driven public policy conversation on water. Some of the key pieces of that are acknowledging that we are facing scarcity. There's no cheap new water available. We're going to be facing some tough choices. No villains, even though everybody can do somewhat better, each of the sectors can do somewhat better at management. No silver bullet solutions. And that we're going to be really facing some needs to bring science into how we manage ecosystems. A lot of the challenges are going to involve some tough trade-offs, and we're going to have to think creatively about how do you address affected parties. If there are trade-offs where some folks are losing out, how do you mitigate for that? And so California passed a water package in November. First time there was a bipartisan water package in a very long time. And so this was really in some ways viewed as historic. And we're saying that there are a lot of good things in that package, but let's not rest on our laurels. So we still a lot to do. So for example, the package gets you a little bit there in terms of some of the water monitoring, but it's not all the way there. And with that, thank you.
The first thing, which I think is germane here, I've been out in LA for a little over 5 years now. And when I first came here, everyone wanted to know what I thought about the difference with traffic here in LA versus Washington, where I came from. And my remark, which wasn't really intended to be flippant, but I pointed out in Washington, the problem was not enough roads. In California, there were too many vehicles. And I thought California actually had the best of it because you could manage too many vehicles a whole lot easier than you could manage not enough roads. And I think there's really a parallel here for the water question, and certainly what Ellen and her group have written about in this report, that it's very easy to pick a pet solution depending on where you stand. But at the end of the day, much of this is going to come about through improved management. And quite frankly, one of the reasons that I think management is going to become a more attractive option is because it's cheap. Certainly cheaper than a lot of the physical solutions that get pointed to. We've got water bill coming up in November that's supposed to go to bond, which is going to be very expensive, and by some measures we really can't afford it, but at the same time it's only part of a solution. So management's cheap. It's people thinking about what they might do and looking for options. So I think that's definitely a good thing. One of the things that was touched on in the report was climate change. And I think climate change is going to be certainly a challenge for thinking about water because the uncertainty bands are huge. I mean, it's one thing to know that climate's changing. It's quite another to know where it's going, which has a couple of implications. One, water is to a large degree about hydrology, and hydrology sort of lives on the historical record. You know, people like to collect records, and we have records that go back 100 years. Some places we have records that go back a couple of 100 years. What we're discovering with climate change, and regardless of which particular ideology you adhere to on this, the fact of the matter is that things are happening, and things are happening more quickly than they used to. And it may be that the past is no longer a terribly reliable predictor of the future. And what do we do in that regard? I have been, at least intellectually, a pretty strong opponent of building new storage up north for many of the reasons you heard Ellen enumerate. It's very expensive. It takes a long time, I mean, which is one of the things that tends to get lost in the noise. If we had the money today to build the storage, we probably wouldn't have any water in the reservoirs for 15 or 20 years, just given the environmental clearance process and all the lawsuits that would ensue, and then actually getting them built and filled. But having said all that, we did a workshop here back in February talking about the impacts of climate change on infrastructure. And I think there's a great deal of uncertainty about what's going to happen in Northern California, particularly at altitudes. I think there's pretty good agreement that the snowpack is going to decrease, or decrease to the point where it goes away. But there are some are saying that instead of being drier, it's going to be warmer and wetter. So we'll still have a lot of water, it's just not going to hang around for a long time like the snowpack does. So then the question becomes, well, gee, maybe it makes some sense to you know, build a few bathtubs so we can actually put the water in against drought. I don't know, but that's something that we're going to have to think about. And I think a lot of the discussion about what we need to do really hinges on how do we pay for a lot of this. And those are questions that this report didn't try to answer, but ultimately at the end of the day, regardless of what we do, somebody's going to have to pay. And at the same time, we're going to have to think about how do we pay for climate change adaptation, things we do if indeed sea level is going to rise. Some people think sea level may rise a couple of centimeters. Some people think sea level may rise a couple of meters. That's a big difference between up to my ankles and over my head. So if we're going to be doing things anyway, it might be wise to kind of put what we do about climate change maybe in a broader context of what we do about water, particularly in places like the Delta. And along those lines, I've got a couple of points I noted here. One is, and again, this is just a personal peccadillo of mine, I think we should make the term wastewater obsolete. I don't think there is any wastewater. I think there's just a resource in different stages of degradation. And I would argue that what we pump out of or flow out of our sewage treatment plants is often of a much higher quality than what we take into our drinking water treatment plants. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. That we basically spend an enormous amount of money treating water before we drink it, and then we spend a larger amount of money treating it before we throw it away. In a time when resources are limited, perhaps we, again, ought to think about how we get our heads around that particular irony, if you will. One point that I will take some issue with in the report, maybe water lawyers understand water law, and they don't think there's any need to fix anything. I think normal people might disagree with that. There is a lot of contentiousness around that, and I don't think it's just people who want to be contentious. I think water law in the West in general, California in specific, is very complicated. It does need to be fixed. Water education takes years, if not decades. That to me is not a problem that says it's well understood and we can work our way through. I think on the political side, I couldn't agree more. One of the benefits to the political process of all these myths is that it really forestalls action on the political side. That because LA wants to steal all the water from the north, or the farmers grow silly crops, or on and on and on, we really can't do anything. And I completely agree the fact that consensus is probably not going, we're probably not going to have win-win-win solutions here. And our political process really needs to impose, not solutions, but they need to impose discipline, that there will be solutions. Because we are running, I don't want to be bright and cheery because it's not my nature. We're running out of time to have opportunities. You know, I don't know that we have opportunities. We still have some time left to do some things. I think we can put solutions in place. I think we can figure it out. The fact that most of California uses far more water per capita than places that have a lot more. You know, there's room to improve, there's room to fix things, and I think the report is absolutely correct that there are no silver bullet solutions. It's just not one thing. Let's throw out the Endangered Species Act and everything will be fine. No, it won't. Any more than, well, let's just build a lot of storage, or let's build the Peripheral Canal and just keep on going the way we are. That's not going to work. So in closing, I'd like to share with you a quote from H.L. Mencken, which I think sums this up perfectly. And he said at some time in the past, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear and simple and wrong. So I would leave you with that.
Richard, thanks very much. Wonderful insights as always. I think I'll just address the one issue that you take issue with, which is the water rights law. Our intention there is basically also to avoid not indecision, because what we're saying is that you have a significant group of very well-meaning, knowledgeable folks whose view about this is that we need to blow the whole system up and rewrite our water law in order to make progress. And I think that's where we're saying, yes, it's a messy system, but there's a lot that you could do without going back to every single water rights title and changing that, and you can make a lot of progress. And you know, people sometimes point to the model of Australia, where, I mean, talking about climate change and the impacts of scarcity, they basically are looking at now, I mean, they've been living with a change in their hydrograph where they're basically getting about 10% of the runoff that they were getting in the not that distant past. And so it's led to some real radical changes in the way they are trying to manage water. And they did blow up their water rights system and change it. They had to blow it up again because the first time they blew it up and changed it, it didn't quite, they missed a few things. So, you know, it's conceivable California at some point will need to do something like that too, but there's probably not the kind of political momentum that you would need at this point to do that, because we're not facing that level of crisis, and yet there are a lot of opportunities with the existing law to push the envelope. And so that's kind of the spirit in which we're doing it. But it's still going to mean a lot of work for lawyers, and there's no question about that.
Question. Two questions. One, the Peripheral Canal, the costs I've seen go anywhere from $6 billion to $53 billion. I was wondering what is causing the variation. And the second thing is, if you look at where could you find more water, if you simply got rid of alfalfa, you would save somewhere between 5 and 20 million acre feet a year, depending on how you calculate how the water for it is how much water it takes. And so I was wondering if you could speculate on the legal and economic issues involved with just shifting the entire crop out of state and then not replacing it.
Okay, well, thank you. Those are both great questions. So just first, the cost of a peripheral canal. When we did our last report on this, so this was July of 2008, we looked at some cost estimates, some sort of broad engineering cost estimates that had been done. They were in our Department of Water Resources report, but I think a lot of the underlying work had actually been funded by Metropolitan Water District. And the scenarios there, we kind of added some extra costs, and we came to like about a range from $5 to $10 billion for the canal, not counting the ecosystem investments, but just the canal. There's been a lot of work being done since then on what a canal might look like, and in fact now what people are talking about is not a canal anymore, they're talking about a tunnel. And the reason is that people don't like eminent domain anymore in California. They don't like it for road widening, and they sure as hell don't like it to build a canal through the Delta that folks in the Delta themselves don't see any benefit to. And so it would have to be quite a wide piece of infrastructure, and so there's a lot of resistance to just the above ground aspects of a canal. So folks have now been looking at just digging underneath to avoid a lot of these impacts. And you know, the rough estimates are coming out at about $10 billion for that piece of infrastructure. Now, if we follow the law of like that, this is doubling every, you know, we said 5 to 10, now it's 20. You know, maybe it'll go up. Oh, sorry, we said 5 to 10. They're saying 10 now when they were saying 5. Maybe it'll be 20. You know, probably something like that is what we're looking at. When you're hearing 53 billion, that's adding a lot of other stuff in there. So that's including surface storage, that's including sort of things that people think are part of a whole package, and it's including an estimate for the tunnel based on the costs, present day costs of building the channel between England and France for the, that was, I mean, it was just kind of off the, super back of the envelope. Okay, so it's, I can tell you that if a canal or tunnel exceeds 30 billion in costs, it's not going to happen. And because at that point, it's not like Southern California needs, and the Bay Area needs it. It's just cheaper at up to a certain point to have that water as part of the system. But we do have alternatives, and that does include expensive desal, and it includes much more draconian conservation. So that's cost side. Why don't we just get the farmers to stop growing those water guzzling crops? So you could do that in theory under reasonable use. If you really could bring a very tight and shut case that was just wasteful in our present day economy. You know, we've tended to kind of have a more free market way of managing economic decisions by businesses, and that includes crops. And what I can say to you is that farmers are pretty good business people. They make decisions at the margin. They're operating with very thin margins, and so when they're growing alfalfa, it's because there's a demand for it. We have a big dairy sector in this state. You know, now there are places where alfalfa is going to be the marginal crop, that some of that water is going to move out of alfalfa into something else through a water market, in the same way that some rice is going to move out. But even, again, rice, you know, you think of it as a low-value crop. We didn't have a very good water market last year, despite the drought, in part because world rice prices were up, in part because of the drought in Australia, and so the guys in the Sac Valley didn't want to sell as much. To me, that seems like sort of dictating economic choices like that is going pretty far in deciding reasonable use relative to sort of saying certain technologies or, you know, spraying water on the pavement is wasteful.
Yeah, I've heard that the water package, the funding, the water package being passed in the fall isn't polling well. Is that what you guys are hearing? And what are the ideas about how to fund all these things that doesn't pass?
Okay, so first, let me just, it's one of my hobby horses. 5 bills were passed into law in November. One of them is a bond measure. 4 were policy bills. Those passed, those are enacted, those are actually underway right now. Those don't go away whether or not the voters say yes or no to the $11 billion water bond that's on the ballot in November. The bond, it's like we've passed a number of water bonds in recent years in California. The public has been relatively supportive of those. This is much big. This is about twice as big as the largest, second largest one that we've passed. It's like the ones we've passed in the last decade or so in that it's kind of got a little bit of something for everybody in it. It's got some ecosystem stuff. It's got some water use efficiency things for urban areas. It's got some groundwater banking. It's got some clean water. It's got a bit of everything. What's new about it is that it also does have money that could be used for surface storage. That was the sort of something that was a sticking point politically before. The one piece of it that is going to make it really hard to have some comprehensive solutions going forward is there's $3 billion in there for the Delta ecosystem, which is not supposed to be the whole thing that we're going to need for the Delta ecosystem. Water users are expected to pay some of that as well as part of sort of mitigation for the canal and so on, but it would help. It would be sort of the additional part if you figure that it's not just water exports that have caused the problems in Delta. There are all kinds of reasons why we have those problems. So if we don't get the bond, you'll have to find the money from someplace else, and that probably means some kind of a water fee on water users around the state or something. That's going to be a challenge to do, but it's not like it's insurmountable. All the other stuff that's in that bond, it would be really nice for users in different sectors to have that money because it basically defrays a lot of the costs that ratepayers would have to pay. So if you get money here in LA for water use efficiency programs, it means that it's your own water rates don't have to go up, or it's cheaper for you to buy your new irrigation technology because you're going to get a rebate from LADWP, for example. But those things, you know, sort of as Richard was saying, management is cheap. A lot of those things are cost effective anyway, and it just means that more of it will have to come from the ratepayer than the taxpayer.
Yeah, on that, well, first off, it's April. November's light years away in terms of this. You know, this isn't a good time to talk about borrowing $11 billion in California. You know, people have other problems. You know, 12% unemployment, all the, you know, local governments are going broke. So I'm not surprised at that. I think as time gets closer, well, let me say, I hope as time gets closer that they will do not so much a selling job, but an informing job about what's in there. As Ellen said, a big piece of this is ecosystem restoration, which is arguably a general fund expenditure. You know, to the extent that anybody benefits from that, we all benefit. So I think we all own the fish and everything else up there. Some of the more direct things, they have worked out some cost recovery systems. They still need to work on that, and they need to make it clear on this exactly who's getting what and who's going to pay for what. But, you know, knowing how polling questions get asked, I'm not surprised that it's not polling well. You know, what do you think about borrowing $11 billion for something you don't understand? Yeah, I'm against it. You know, I mean, and I think that will get better, but, you know, at some point they're going to roll out Jamie Lee Curtis and some other people to smile and say why we need to do this. And hopefully that will carry the day, because this is important, even if it's got some stuff in it that, you know, I may think is suboptimal. I think the way the package was constructed is that, you know, it makes it hard to say no on everything, as opposed to saying yes on something maybe you're not terribly happy with.
The Arc Storm group, which is looking at the 200 to 500-year flood in Sacramento's report, is also due in September, which will potentially have a huge impact on that bond. I don't know if it will be positive or negative, but if it comes out that, you know, a flood which is potentially due in the next 20 to 40 years, will wipe out water for Southern California for 2 years. I think something to see a change in support for the bond.
Right. So I should say, I think some of the polling that's been reported has been sort of what you'd call push polling, in the sense that it's been worded at, do you think it's worth this if it's going to cost $700 million a year to the taxpayer to pay this back, right? We have, so PPIC does public opinion polling on a regular basis, and we haven't yet asked the language of the specific language of the bond, but right after the package was passed, there was a more general question about how important it was to pass a bond to address some of these water issues, and the response was really very positive. It was like between strongly favor and moderately favor it, so strongly support and moderately support, it was like 75% that were positive. So, you know, I think we'll have to see once there's sort of some serious polling about with the language of the bond.
Well, you certainly, your group is certainly in charge of getting the pulse of the California. I think our time is out, but if you have a very short question that requires a reasonably short answer, maybe the last.
It's a short question, but I don't know if the answer is short. I've heard there's regulation coming about groundwater, and the groundwater will be like mineral rights owned, and if you don't already have access to it, it'll be obtained by the model water districts, and they will own it, and or even all of it may be owned, and you have to pay for it to have access to it.
So that's certainly not what passed in November. I mean, there was one of the policy bills was a groundwater monitoring bill, and it got watered down considerably. So what it requires is that groundwater levels have to be monitored in all basins, and they're still working out sort of the details of exactly who's got to do that and so on at the local level. The reason it got watered down, so to speak, is that there's some folks in some parts of the state that cling very fiercely to the idea that it's nobody's business, but the overliers, what happens to the groundwater. Under current California law, groundwater is basically a riparian right. So it's basically, if you're overlying it, you can use it. There are some rights that have been established by some folks that are not overliers, but they are junior to the overliers. Now, the idea of having the water district own it and you have to pay for it, actually, you know, most of urban Southern California already has systems that are kind of like that. So there are two kinds of systems. One is an adjudicated basin, and that's where there are shares, basically, of the groundwater in the ground that are kind of partitioned out among the users in a quantified way. And then the other is the special management district. Orange County has that, Orange County Water District, where it's basically Orange County Water District can charge you a price for pumping, and they set that in order to be able to recharge. So it's kind of relates. And those are the systems that work well. So to me, this kind of regulation is basically, it's what you kind of need to get to a safe yield system, especially when you've got more and more competition for the use. But you know, there are growing pains to get there. Southern California got there because there was overuse of the resource, and they had to.
Well, with that, please join me in thanking you.